This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
Give me a minute and I'll point to you.
You're listening to the Addressing Gettysburg podcast.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start in about 2 minutes or so, but I want to do a couple things first. Thank you all for being here on what is not the best day. The weather's a little rough out, but we appreciate you making it here for the lecture this afternoon. I also thank you for masking. I'm taking my mask off now just so that you can hear me while I speak. Bert, who's going to be presenting today, is going to do likewise, but otherwise we'll have our masks on. And we thank you for doing the same. It's the only way we can have the lectures in the theater, which, you know, we're at the point where we'll do pretty much anything to get back to some level of normality. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge the fact that Bert Barnett, who's been a ranger for the National Park Service since 1988, is actually retired. December the 31st was his last official day working for the National Park Service, and so he's here today entirely in a voluntary capacity. Bert's worked, of course, at Gettysburg, but also at Eisenhower, at Stones River, at Kennesaw Mountain National Battlefield. He has been a wonderful colleague, a wonderful ranger to work with, and it's really a great loss to the National Park Service. And so I didn't want to leave today without acknowledging the wonderful work that Bert has done during his career as a federal employee. And so just want to acknowledge that, Bert. And so with that said, just give me 1 minute. I'm going to get my live stream going so visitors can see it at home. And then, Bert, when I point to you, you're good to go. All right.
Thank you. Well, as Chris said, we are endeavoring to continue with the programs we have out here, and I'm glad to see all of you today as well. What we're going to take a look at, as the title slide indicates here this afternoon, is the turning point. And as Chris hinted here a little bit, it's kind of a turning point for me, so I decided I would take a look at what turning points mean to other folks, and specifically the turning point that the entry into the war meant for so many folks, and specifically the two that you see there, Jefferson Davis and George Thomas. I also happen to like poetry, so I figured that I would dig a little bit into this. In this particular verse, I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, the fellow that wrote that was of a particular connection to this all as well, the quintessential Yankee poet known as Robert Frost. And why Robert Frost? Well, Robert Frost has a particular connection here as well, because Robert Frost had a father, as most folks do, Will Frost, a hard-drinking, pistol-packing newspaperman who once ran away from his home in Massachusetts during the Civil War, intent to join the Confederate Army. He was stopped short in this attempt by police, who captured him in Philadelphia and returned him to his parents. And that stopped short his intent there. But Will ran away again later, this time to California, where in 1874 he named his son, later remembered as the quintessential Yankee poet Robert Lee Frost, after his Confederate hero, General Robert E. Lee. But all of this connects in a particular way, because going back to our two primaries here, George Thomas and Jefferson Davis, and again continuing on with Robert Frost here just a little bit. A sorry eye would not travel both, for it split and bent in the undergrowth. On regrets and alternate choices. Jefferson Davis perhaps began to experience this the earliest, where he wrote to his sister Lucinda a few years following his 1828 graduation from the United States Military Academy. Jefferson Davis observed that Army life was at least more honorable than being a politician, whose struggles begun in folly are closed in disgrace. General Thomas, after acquiring a level of personal recognition from service in the Civil War, had to turn down repetitive requests from incessant media sorts. Why is it that you're a Virginian and yet you stayed with the Union Army? He had to explain, all that I did for my government are matters of history, but my private life is my own, and I will not have it hawked about in print for the amusement of the curious. And you find that quote in George Thomas, Virginian for the Union. Now here's the birthplace of Jefferson Davis in Fairview, Kentucky. And now when you get to that location, you will see, curiously enough, a monument. Looks a little bit like the Washington Monument, but a little bit smaller. Now, in his youth, Davis will meet President Jackson and on his way in his travels, and that meeting is described as unaffected and well-bred. The birthplace of George Thomas at Newsome's Depot, Virginia, very in the lower portion of Virginia near North Carolina, will have some interesting connections to it as well. I want to highlight a little bit of that here. When you go to Southampton County, Virginia, you will see all of the descriptions that you see here. And as you read it very carefully, all of the history of Southampton County that they want to describe there, you would think that somebody like George Thomas would be a major figure that they would want to impress upon their county plaques there, but it seems that they're forgetting someone there, aren't they? Yeah. But one of the things that they do make mention of there is the Nat Turner Rebellion, and that's going to be a little bit of a critical input on the growth and the experience of George Thomas's upbringing. The revolt that takes place in that portion of the portion of Southampton County will kill 60 white men, women, and children, involve nearly 70 enslaved and free blacks, some mounted. In suppressing that rebellion, the state executed 56 blacks, and militias killed anywhere from 56 to 120 blacks, most of whom were not involved with the rebellion. The revolt likely shook the Thomas family. However, the beliefs that the general himself had on this did not turn him into a deep-rooted abolitionist at all, because when he was serving in Texas, he purchased at least one slave for his use. Now, of course, the impression of slave culture was a little bit different at Davis Bend, where Jefferson Davis would grow up and have his experiences there. Let me catch there. He would have quite a number of slaves in the time that he was learning of the slave culture of Mississippi. There's another picture, and this was actually a photograph of Davis Bend that would be taken away from that area by one of the workers after the war was over. Although these two have a little bit of a different impressions of things in their cultures, they will both wind up going to West Point, but the times that they serve at West Point as students will be a little bit different. Davis will go to West Point between 1824 and 1829. And when he gets there, he's not going to be the most studious of sorts. He will rack up demerits. He will enjoy it as something of a party school, and will shoot his musket out of one of the barracks windows on a bet, and is one of the partiers at what comes to be known as the Great Grog Raid, that gets a number of cadets into trouble at that point in time. He will graduate 29th out of 33 cadets at the year that he graduates as an infantry officer. Now, George Thomas takes things a little more differently. He has a little bit more of preparation in his background before he actually becomes a cadet there in the years that he served as a cadet. First of all, his years, again, are 1836 to 1840. Had studied law before he enters, and roomed the first year with Sherman, and graduates 12th in his class. And of course, anybody who knows me and a lot of the stuff that I have done and I have written here, if I can boast of myself for just a moment, he goes into the artillery, so good guy for him there. So he will spend a little bit more attentive to detail sort of stuff there. But when they get out, their interests will begin to wane and differ again. When they begin to get out and serve, Davis will begin to have a wandering eye, and he will find in the early portions of his career that he will be associated with General Zachary Taylor. And of course, Zachary Taylor has a daughter, and he will begin to become attracted to the general's daughter, and the general will warn him away from doing that. He doesn't like the idea of a military family, doesn't like soldiers courting, but that's not going to be any good. The emotion between the two of them will eventually cause Davis to leave the service so that he can marry Sarah Knox Taylor. Taylor disapproves of this, and eventually he will approve Davis's leaving the Army. On the 17th of June, 1835, the two of them will be married. Davis will take her down to Mississippi so that he can go into the planting business. She can become a planter's wife. She writes that the country here is quite healthy. Now, we're talking deep Mississippi at this point along the river. There's a lot to be feared at that point in time. Right now we're in the middle of a plague. Plagues were one of those things that were common along the river at that point in time. Again, 1835, June. The country here is quite healthy. Well, of course, she's not a doctor. And she is dead on the 15th of September. Malaria or yellow fever, we're not quite sure which of that takes that. And of course, as soon as this spark of Jefferson Davis's life hits, then he will change forever, because the free spirit goes out of him at that point. And we're not quite sure from the readings, the estimations, whatever it is, but the light goes out of him, and he becomes more controlled, more distant. He begins to become, at that point, the Jefferson Davis that folks remember from the Civil War era. Now, between the both of them, between Thomas and Davis, they basically have 3 wives in that history span. Thomas will marry as well in November of 1852 to a Frances Lucretia Kellogg of Troy, New York, and she becomes noted as a true soldier's wife, and will accompany her husband to his frontier postings in Texas and other posts. Lucretia will die in Troy, New York, amongst her family members in 1889, after the general does. But Davis, after a period of deep grieving, will remarry again to a young woman, Verena Ann Banks Howell, a Natchez-born, Philadelphia-educated young lady. She, like Frances, will outlive her husband, dying in 1906. Both women provided support to their spouses given the difficult choices they had made. Because remember, Thomas will wind up wearing the blue suit, much to the displeasure of the Virginia connections that he has. So both of them are going to need that support from their spouses. Davis and the Briarfield plantation that will be given to him by his brother, Joseph, will, by 1860, have 113 slaves that Davis owns. Davis, by his research, did not believe in whipping his slaves if it could be avoided, and will set up a mock court so that slaves can judge other slaves for particular offenses. And that's what he will try and do with that as he's beginning to build his lifestyle at that particular point. George Thomas, as he stays with the American Army, the Union Army, whatever approbation you want to put onto it, he will demonstrate his loyalty to the Union by going into the Second Seminole War, which is a pretty nasty outfit at that particular point. You get a lot of not only hostile environment down there, but the Seminoles are pretty fierce fighters, and Thomas will win his first brevet down in Florida as a first lieutenant for gallant and good conduct on the 6th of November, 1841, and in the Second Seminole War. Now, Davis will learn to be a fighter as well in his own particular way. He will be elected to the House of Representatives in 1845, where he meets John C. Calhoun and begins to reflect to some degree Calhoun's positions on states' rights. Unlike Calhoun, Davis also supports bills for internal improvements. While in the House, the Mexican-American War will break out, and Davis will take leave to raise a regiment, the 1st Mississippi Rifles. And he will head to Mexico and command the 1st Mississippi Volunteer Infantry at the battles of Monterey, Buena Vista, fighting down there. Now, given the attention he paid at West Point, it is not surprising to learn that he will get wounded in the foot. He will return home for R&R and discovers that his overweening brother, Joseph, will send in his resignation to Congress. But he is still a war hero, so he will gladly accept the appointment to the U.S. Senate that his state has put in for him, and he will be reconfirmed to the state legislature in 1848. So his career track is on, as well as Thomas's career track being on. Thomas, while he is in Mexico, demonstrates a determination and a skill with the guns. He led a gun crew with distinction at the battles of Fort Brown, Resaca de la Palma, Monterey, and Buena Vista, receiving 3 brevet promotions. At Buena Vista, General Taylor reported that the services of the light artillery, always conspicuous, were more than unusually distinguished during the battle. Brigadier General John E. Wool wrote about Thomas and another officer that without our artillery, we would not have maintained our position a single hour. Thomas's battery commander, wrote that Thomas's coolness and firmness contributed not a little to the success of the day. Lieutenant Thomas more than sustained the reputation that he has long enjoyed in his regiment as an accurate and scientific artillerist. So both of these fellows, in their own way, are polishing their skills. But these skills are not ultimately going to benefit on the wider scale, because Davis in the Senate will begin to develop something of a fierce oratory. He becomes known, Davis does here, in this Senate term as a leading Southern voice. Here's an example of this. On the 7th of May, 1849, he begins to become known as a fire eater. And in Jackson, Mississippi, he will stand up against what he perceives and what many are beginning to perceive as northern interest versus southern interest. Men of another section allowed in their advice that there is no danger, that action now would be hazardous or useless, and that the generosity and philanthropy of the North will always prove a sufficient safeguard to Southern rights. Every compromise has been to our loss, a Southern loss. As witnesses that of the Northwestern Territory and that of Missouri, we have yielded thus far, and the results have been that upon our tame submission is now based the demand that we yield the remainder. The equality left by our fathers is to be destroyed. So, if you remember that term, fire eaters, this is what Davis is beginning to become. It will assure his seat as a politician, but in the larger region, does it do the nation good? Got to start asking that question. Thomas, meanwhile, takes his combat skills learned in the Mexican War, learned in Florida, and he will receive the post of instructor of artillery at West Point in 1851. Impressing West Point's superintendent, Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, Thomas was also given the duties of cavalry instructor. Now, there is that old axiom that those who can't do, teach. But this is not exactly true in this case, because after a stint as a teacher in the spring of 1854, Thomas will be shipped to Fort Yuma, California, and by the following year was a major in the U.S. 2nd Cavalry. However, he would not stay there long. He was soon shipped to Texas, and Texas is beginning to boil up on its own. He will be stationed at Fort Mason for a time, which covered the northern route from San Antonio to El Paso in that broad expanse of connecting roads there. But there will have a new president who will have slightly different ideas. President Pierce, Franklin Pierce, is elected in the early 1850s, and he will draw Jefferson Davis to become Secretary of War from 1853 to 1857. That's Davis's new job, and this will offer, I'm not sure if offer or impose is the right word, but he will take this war hero, Jefferson Davis, from Mississippi and make him Secretary of War. And Davis will now be entrusted with a variety of responsibilities that begin to kind of crack open Davis's skull a little bit and pour things into Davis's limited mind that he had not had a chance to see before. And this is what gives Davis a broader vision. The national potential of the United States will conflict with some of those limited things that Davis had been working with in the past. Davis will be sent, he will actually send, rather, a lower graded officer, a fellow by the name of McClellan, by the way. He will send McClellan to the Crimea to report on how they are fighting that war. And the report that comes back under McClellan will say, you know, those guys are fighting with rifled muskets. They're not using the smoothbore guns that we've been using, like in the Mexican-American War. And that will catch Davis's attention. And that's why we begin in 1855 to develop the 1855 rifled Springfield musket, and then the 1861 rifled Springfield musket. We begin to improve our shoulder arms, and so we will have, just in time for the outbreak of the Civil War, a whole bunch of rifled Springfield shoulder arms. And because the country has been expanding as a result of the Mexican War, we now need a bigger place to hold the legislature of the United States. The last time we did that was in the 1840s, and so there will be more occasions to do that. So we're going to have to build a new, or at least expand the Capitol. Chief Engineer Montgomery Meigs will work with Jefferson Davis on a number of important engineering projects. Enlarging the Capitol building will be one of these where Meigs and Davis work together. By the way, none of those new windows will open. They are strictly ornamental. Congressmen and staffers will curse Jeff Davis for years on account of that, given the heat of Washington, until the next renovation of the Capitol in the early 1900s. And of course, one last little look. You will notice, of course, there's a dome on the top of that. There's going to be a new enhanced dome on the top of that. And of course, there will be a figure that has to be placed at the top of that dome. And here's where you get a good chance to really peer into the convoluted caverns of Jeff Davis's mind here. The first design on your left will be rejected by Davis because the figure wears a liberty cap symbolizing the freedom obtained through manumission, that is, of freed slaves. Can't have that, according to Davis. The middle design, or the right design, the one on the far right, will be rejected because the figure holds a laurel wreath suggesting peace. One cannot always have peace without war. The third design in the center of the three will be Davis's design, the headdress of an eagle feathers shaped like a helmet without being a helmet, because that symbolizes war, to serve as a cap without being a cap. And that, of course, is what graces the top of the Capitol now. So that gives you an idea of just exactly how pettifogging, to use that term, Davis's mind can become. And of course, they're in the middle of this project when Lincoln will take the oath in 1861. But it's actually part of the Davis/Pierce project to enhance the Capitol. A little bit more of the Davis influence from the Secretary of War time is the aqueduct when that was designed after a major fire in Washington in 1857, and Meigs will take Davis's name off the construction plaque sign in there. You'll see it right there where they remove it after the war starts, and when TR will restore it in the turn of the century or 1900s. And of course the Gadsden Purchase. And one of the things that was near and dear to Davis's heart, he tried to get this done at his first stab as a member of the House of Representatives, but they laughed him down on it. But when he became Secretary of War, he was able to impose it, bringing camels from the Mideast, and have them to bring ordnance across the deserts of Texas. And that brings us back to Major Thomas and what he's doing at this point in time. He eventually made his way to Fort Mason, where he was ordered to occupy. During his time with the 2nd Cavalry, Thomas was in acting command of the regiment following the extended leave of Colonel Robert E. Lee in October of 1857. Thomas would lead 2 notable expeditions from the fort, during one of which he received 2 superficial but very painful arrow wounds, which resulted on November 1st, 1860, in a 12-month sick leave. Therefore, he was in New York upon the secession of Texas from the Union. Thomas would rejoin the 2nd Cavalry on April the 14th, 1861 at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Now, when Thomas would come back east, one of the things that he would do would bring information about who they thought would be a loyal officer and who he thought would be a disloyal officer. And this would be a very important thing because there's a fellow by the name of General David E. Twiggs who Thomas felt had a very secessionist heart. And, of course, that turned out to be very accurate. Now, Pierce, of course, winds up leaving the White House at the end of his term when Buchanan moves in. And that will be a little bit of an interesting time because Davis will wind up going back to the Senate. And when he does, after this experience as the Secretary of War, he has now had a much broader vision of the United States than he had before. And as a senator, he now has a chance to go and speak in various places. And so he speaks in Boston at Faneuil Hall in 1858 in the fall. He goes up to this Massachusetts wonderland and he inspires folks up there with just how moderate he actually is. Moderate, calming speeches flow from his lips. He gets an honorary degree from Bowdoin College, the same place that we all know as Joshua Chamberlain's nest. And he says there, "Madness must rule the hour when the American citizens, trampling as well upon the great principles at the founding and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, shall turn with interseen hand." In other words, if we're going to tear ourselves up, we must be mad. To sacrifice themselves as well as their brethren upon the altar of sectional fanaticism. In other words, we'd be crazy to do that sort of stuff. Now, of course, when he does this, the Southern media begins to lose its head. It begins to spin right off. One of the primary media outlets in the South is the Charleston Mercury. And they report the following: of all of the signal examples of startling Southern defection that the venality of the times has afforded, there is none that at all can compare with this. The Jefferson Davis that we loved is no more. What a pitiable spectacle of human weakness and political tergiversation. And it concludes the following: Davis should not only go to Boston, but stay there. But towards the end of the 1850s, it is evident that Davis has had a very rough time. One of the things that plagues him by this time is the effect of his military service. In the early days when he was serving up in the Old Northwest, wading in those cold rivers, directing logs, trying to build forts, before he left the Army, he caught some kind of eye disease, and it's begun to metastasize into certain areas of his system. So it's really hit him, and that will continue. You will continue to hear accounts of what's going on with him at that point. He also, because of the pressure with the hostility north versus south, and now he is trying to come to grips with the pressures of that after the experience he has seen of what the nation could be, all of that is beginning to really get to him. A reporter in May of 1860 will note this, that Davis, quote, possesses the face of a corpse, the form of a skeleton. Look at the haggard, sunken, weary eye, The thin white wrinkled lips clasped close upon the teeth in anguish. This is the mouth of a brave but impatient sufferer. See the ghostly white, hollow, bitterly puckered cheek, the high, sharp cheekbone, the pale brow full of fine wrinkles. He's trying to hold his state back from doing something a little wackier than he would like, but he fails. Yet he has to go, and at the secession of Mississippi, he has to go and deliver a farewell to the Senate when his state leaves. It's one of those things that many of the other Southern senators have to do as well. And he will wind up with, in the course of my service here, I see now around me some with whom I have served long. There have been points of collision, blah, 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 blah. You know, that sort of thing. It's not what he wanted to do, but he felt it's something that he had to do. And it's going to get worse because now that he is seen as a political moderate, he's the sort of fellow that they're going to wind up pushing into the center of the fire. He is now a man without a country. On the 30th of January, he will write a letter stating to the folks back home, the post of President of the Provisional Government is one of great responsibility and difficulty. I have no confidence in my capacity to meet its requirements. I think I could perform the function of a general, but frankly I would prefer not to have either place. And they will turn around and on the 9th of February elect him their president. Barina, his wife, records his reaction when the message comes. The messenger with the notification found him in our garden. When reading the telegram, he looked so grieved that I feared some evil had befallen our family. And indeed it had. After a few minutes' painful silence, he told me, as a man might speak of a sentence of death, because he had seen the nation at its peak. And here, not just Mississippi, but many of the other states had chosen this path. Getting back to what his wife wrote, as he neither desired nor expected the position, he was more deeply depressed than before. Of course, George Thomas, his decision was to stay in the uniform that he had been familiar with for so many years. His decision was not political, but personal. He had already turned his back on family, and he would continue along that track. That path had already been laid out for him, but he was never trusted. He was always that Southerner, and it reflected in the sort of assignments he got, the way he was treated, and the cost of following their paths would be notable. For George Thomas, at the end of the war, George Thomas did not appear in the glorious Grand Review, but stayed in the South with his troops. In the immediate post-war period, he continued to serve in Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. When you think about George Thomas, what battle do you associate him with the most? Where? Exactly. Okay. He refused Grant's belated promotion to lieutenant general, realizing the hollowness of the much-delayed gesture, commenting, if they were going to have done it, they'd have done it for Chickamauga. Rejecting the politics of Washington and President Johnson's offer to become Grant's successor and thereby get another crack at a lieutenant generalcy, Thomas instead accepted the command of the Division of the Pacific in 1869. There he died of a stroke the following year at the Presidio on March 29, 1870. At his funeral in Troy, New York, no Virginia relative, let that sink in for a second, no Virginia relative, including his sisters, appeared in attendance. Now, when you drive into Washington now, on the northwest portion of it, one of those great equestrian statues is Thomas Circle. When an attempt was made, and this is just ironic, this is unbelievably ironic, when an attempt was made to beautify the 1879 Thomas equestrian statue, acorns were collected from his homestead and planted near the sculpture. None sprouted. For Davis, from a letter to former President Franklin Pierce, written January 20th, 1861, as he had served as Pierce's Secretary of War and had seen the capacities of the North, and he knew what was coming, Davis noted, I know not what may devolve upon me after my return to Mississippi. Civil war has only horror for me, but whatever circumstances demand shall be met as a duty, and I trust be so discharged that you will not be ashamed of our former connection or cease to be my friend. And of course, Pierce came from Vermont. Both of these men had experienced and contributed much for the common country preparing to tear itself apart at their feet. They both dreaded this development, as both had much to lose. We like to study history, but many times, seemingly we ignore the parallels at our feet. If we are to insist upon fierce partisanship in the present moment, actively admiring the one as we despise the other, should we not likewise acknowledge the feeling of dread inherent upon the collapse of the country, a feeling both of these men faced? At that moment, their Polaris was a simple, unquestioned duty, as each perceived it to be. Whatever the cost, personal and professional. It's something to think on. And good afternoon.